In this lesson, we want to test interactions with LiveViews. After all, that's what LiveViews are all about. So we're going to look at a very canonical, simple example, a counter. We're going to see how to test a counter. If you go to your router, you'll see that we have a counter live. Go ahead and open that up. Now this counter is doing something very simple. You can launch your Phoenix servers and take a look at it. We have a minus sign to decrement the counter. We have a plus sign to increment the counter, and the count is there right in the middle. In terms of our HTML, that looks like this. We have a button with an SVG in there. The ID here is decrement. You see we have a Phoenix click to decrease this. In the same way, for the increase button, we have a Phoenix click that will send the increase event, and the ID of this button is increment. The account itself has an ID, and that will be helpful later, but that's just a div that is holding the count state. Our mount is pretty simple. We're starting with a count of 0, and when we get the increase event, we update the count, adding 1 to the count, and when we get the decrease event, we decrease the count by 1. So let's go ahead and take a look at our test. Now, as you might imagine, that's found under test, Ranger Web, live, counter live test. So let's write a first test. Let's write that the user can increase the counter. We'll take in the connection struct as usual, and we'll do a little bit of setup, just a normal one. We'll use the view in this case and ignore the HTML. And let's mount this in the counter path. Perfect. Now what are we going to do? We're going to grab our view and we're going to target an element. We've seen the element helper in the last lesson, but this time we're actually going to use it, and it's pretty powerful. So we're going to use the view, and it takes a CSS selector and an optional text filter. In this case, because our buttons don't have text, I'm just going to use the CSS selector. Otherwise, I might pass the text filter. But let's go ahead and target this by ID. If you remember, this has an increment ID. And then we're going to use our first, what I call action functions, our render click. The render click takes in the element, and it's going to perform the event on LiveView and then re-render the page. So we could grab some HTML here, and we'll actually do that in a little bit. But what I want to do first is write our assertion the way I like to write them. And the way I do this is I use the has element helper. So we'll ask if we have the element with ID count, and it should be 1. Perfect. Let's go ahead and run this test. Excellent, it passes. So this is the fundamental of how we test interactions. We grab a view, we target an element, and then we perform an action on it. There are also other render actions like render blur, render focus, render key down, render key up, things like that. And we'll actually see how we interact with some of the ones that interact with forms in the future. But the ones that are not dealing with forms, they all follow this same pattern. You have a view, an element, and you then perform the action function. But I want to show you 2 other ways to write this test, and I think they're a little bit inferior, and I'll tell you why in each case. First, let's talk about an alternative assertion. I'll go ahead and copy the test. Let's change this. What we'll do here is we'll change the assertion to use the HTML returned from this render click. In this case, all we have to assert is that in that HTML we have the counter being 1. Now, we saw this a little bit in the previous lesson, but the problem with this is that this is not a very specific assertion. All we're saying is that anywhere in this HTML there should be a number 1. Since this is the HTML for the whole page, it could be anything. It could be an h1 tag. So let's go ahead and run the test to make sure it passes. But now let's see how easy it is to fool this test. I'm going to go back to our LiveView, and I'm going to add an h1 tag here. Let's call it counter. And then I'm going to delete the counter, or the count itself right here. Right? I'm going to delete that, save that, and now I'm going to rerun the test. Now the test is going to pass because we still have the h1 in there. So it's finding a number 1 string in there. And so that's why this assertion is sometimes useful, and we'll see maybe later when we can use it. But for the most part, I like to rely on the has element helper because we can be specific about our assertions. So I'll go ahead and put this back and go back to our test. Right. So That's why I don't like this as much as this scenario where we use the hasElement helper. The next way I want to write this test is to use an alternate action function. So let's go ahead and copy the top one. And instead of using render click that takes 2 arguments, we can use the render click that takes 3 arguments. The view, it takes the event itself, so this targets the event directly. So we'll call this increase. And it could take other options. In this case, we don't actually have other options, so we can just do this in a single line. And I'll just call this target event directly. So this is again render click. It looks like the same function, but there's a big distinction. Let's go ahead and run this test to see it pass. Excellent. So what is the problem with this test? The problem with this test is that we're not using the element helper. And the element helper, when combined with an action function, these render clicks, is very, very powerful and helpful in making sure that we have HTML defined. So let's go ahead and go to the counter live, and we're going to delete the entire increment button, right? So you would imagine that our test would not pass, but if we run it again, it's going to pass, right? So that is surprising behavior because our test is telling us that we are incrementing things successfully, but in production our code is broken. The reason why this is happening is because the test is targeting the event directly. So it's sending the message to the LiveView directly. And so it bypasses all the HTML that we had defined. That's why that element helper is so powerful and useful. So I'll go ahead and put it back as it was. Now we've written 3 tests for the increment side. If you're up for it, I want you to go ahead and write a test for the decrement size. How do you decrease the counter? And I want you to see what it's like if you remove the element helper, or what if you only remove the Phoenix click attribute and you're using the element helper? What kinds of errors do you get? I hope you enjoy that, and I'll see you in the next lesson.